Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast that doesn't step up to get on the train. I am Jason from Not Just Bikes. I am joined today by writer and rail engineer Gareth Dennis. Welcome to the show, Gareth.
Hello, it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have listened to you on various podcasts before and on your Rail Natter, and I've read some of your stuff online. I was in Japan recently, and I rode a lot of trains while I was there. I was there for about 3 weeks, and I don't even want to think about how many trains I rode. But basically, all of the trains had level boarding. And at first, I didn't really think too much about it. But then I was realizing, wow, this is actually really, really convenient. And as soon as I got back to the Netherlands, as soon as I got back to Schiphol, and I went to get on the train, I had to step up to get on the train. And I thought, we need to talk about this. And I thought there's no one better to talk about level boarding than Gareth Dennis. And there's a reason why that is. So tell everybody a little bit about why level boarding is a thing for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a long time, I cared a lot about accessibility and about widening access onto the railways for everyone, not just for the standardized human that we think of as the standard railway passenger. Right. And I found myself loudly championing some of the problems, specifically with Crossrail actually in London and the mistakes they'd made in the design, fundamental issues with the design of that railway as it is now built wrongly, which we can talk about later, I'm sure. Yeah. I found myself in a pumpkin cafe in Darlington Station across the table from Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson, who's one of my childhood heroes, actually. She's a Paralympian. She's a pretty legendary presence in terms of accessibility sphere. And she uses the train all the time and has an absolutely miserable time of it. And the way she puts it is that she just wants to have the same miserable time commuting by a train that everyone else has.
Not an even more miserable time, yes.
Exactly. Lots of people push back, and including within my industry saying, well, the setup we have now with ramped access, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that not everyone uses ramped access. Therefore, it's a bespoke feature for a small number of passengers. Actually, it's not that small a number of passengers. 20% of people have some form of mobility issue. But, you know, that is not independent travel. If you have to call someone ahead and hope that a ramp appears where you're going. And it's not just about disabled people. And we'll talk about what level boarding actually is, this thing that I'm wobbling around in my virtual house.
Yeah, maybe we should actually do that. Just for anybody who is not familiar with level boarding. Because I remember in the early days of my channel, I made a video about traffic calming. And I talked about all this traffic calming and different types of traffic calming. And almost all the comments were, what the hell is traffic calming? So yeah. I'm not going to make any assumptions. People come from all different backgrounds. What do we mean when we say level boarding?
So level boarding very specifically refers to there being a smooth, uninterrupted, level kind of interface from the platform. So the thing on the station that you stand on before you're on the train onto the train itself. So then you're standing on the floor in the train. So what that generally will look like is that the platform level and the train floor level will be at the same height. And there will not be an excessive gap, you know, so you're talking kind of much less than an inch, ideally not much more than a thumb distance, either between the train itself or perhaps with what's often used as a gap filler, a little thing that shoots out from the train. So some form of step, but that should not be a big drop. It should be basically the same level, so flat from the train floor onto the surface of the platform. So that's what level boarding is. Fundamentally, that's what it is. And it's a funny one because you can't think of it in isolation because obviously that's useless if you can't get onto the platform. So if you have a platform that is on the other side of where you've arrived in the station, whether it's by bus or whatever it is, by car, or however you've got to the station, or walking or wheeling, and the platform you need to catch is on the other side of a footbridge that has no accessible lift, then level boarding's a waste of time. But vice versa, if you've got an accessible, whether in the US and it's ADA, or if in the UK it's AFA, or if you're in Europe, an accessible footbridge of some kind with lifts or whatever it is, or a subway, and you don't have level boarding, then it's all very well. Then you're just stuck on a platform without any ability to get onto the train. So it's part of the wider system. It cannot be looked at in isolation, but it's a critical part. Funnily enough, getting people on and off trains, you'd think that allowing everyone to get on and off the train would be like the number one design feature of that railway system. Sadly not.
Well, obviously, level boarding is important for people who are in wheelchairs, for instance, but also if you're somebody who's pushing a stroller, as I have done when we lived in London, for example, when we had our first child, and even Taiwan. Ooh, that was something else. So we are pushing strollers onto public transit, and even that was a pain in the ass. But if you have luggage, or even if you just have any kind of mobility issue,
looking
where
at your phone, you know.
Yeah, or yeah, and even beyond that, it even goes beyond that. Like you could just be maybe not paying attention and trip, right? And this happens to perfectly able-bodied people.
Yeah.
So this is way more than just like a wheelchair person thing.
Yeah. And actually, maybe this is a perfect time to just kind of list off the three main reasons why level boarding is critical, right? So the number one reason is actually not accessibility. In terms of like the main reason why level boarding should be seen as an absolutely critical component in the railway system is because, and this is true for the British railway system, and I dare say it'll be true for a lot of other railway systems as well, the number one risk that's getting worse, not better, for the GB railway, it's one of the safest in Europe, and it is pretty much everything is getting, or until recent shenanigans anyway, so until a point which I'm going to put a line in the sand of 2 years ago when my data runs up to and before things got screwy, everything was getting better in terms of safety except one thing, and that was platform train interface risk, which is a fancy way of saying people tripping over, getting off a train, getting on a train, falling between a train, getting bumped by trains at the platform. So that risk, and it's an enormous risk. We measure risk on the railway, as lots of industries do, in the form of what we call fatalities and weighted injuries. And this is true for traffic and all sorts of other things. So you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, Jason.
Yeah, sure.
You have fatalities, but also you have a multiplier for like major minor injuries, for other sorts of injuries. So you can pool not just the people who get killed, but also all those injuries. So it's a good way of saying, okay, one person in 100 million people traveling will get killed versus like 100 million people get a small injury. If you like, it's a way of weighting. And in GB, fatalities and weight injuries for platform train interface is 13. Now, that's 13 people killed or the equivalent of killed on our rail. It sounds an arbitrary number on its own. That's an enormous number. A huge amount of money has been spent for raising parapet heights for electrification in the British Railway network. Hundreds of millions of pounds extra on electrification projects to raise parapets. The fatalities and weighted injuries for that risk is like 0.01. And we have spent a huge amount of money, and yet there is zero dedicated funding for solving level boarding issues. So safety, number one thing, safety, really key. And that's true for every country. So that's the first thing. Second thing is accessibility. The fact that we have a railway system that cannot be used independently by everyone is not good enough in a world where we need to be driving modal shift onto public transport.
Yeah, it's really not. It's not even close to good enough. Like,
yeah, exactly. And that's for people, as you say, wheelchairs, any form of mobility. You know, if you're older, if you've got luggage, I'm exactly the same as you. I've been pushing a buggy around with our little one using trains, and it's hopeless. And the number of times usually she's not in the buggy because I'm nervous to have her in the buggy when we come out of it. So I'll carry her and get someone else to push the buggy. It's horrible. Luggage, we're all getting older, shuffling around. Bicycles, getting bikes on and off trains.
Bicycles too.
All this stuff. The bicycle and the train are absolutely a match made in heaven. So let's make the interface for people moving their bikes, particularly when you've got e-bikes, which are that great opportunity for more people to use bikes. E-bikes are heavy. Lifting those onto a train is really hard work, particularly if you've got a big gap.
I've had a hell of a time trying to get bikes up onto GO trains in Toronto area, which again, like that step up. And actually, one of the annoying things about the GO train is that there is this big step up into the GO train, but then it also has a section that's for wheelchair users. So part of the platform is at level, and then people in wheelchairs can get just there to that one carriage that's for wheelchairs. But it's like, you know what height the platform's going to be. You did it. Why don't you just do it for the rest of the? Why does it have to be one part? It blows my mind that there's one part. So it's like they're like, oh yes, wheelchair users will have to get on. Oh, let's just do this to part of the platform.
And we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it, I'm sure. So like accessibility, and sometimes the disabled community rightly get defensive of the word accessibility. So I'll say accessibility and broader, everyone being able to use the train. So it's not just accessibility from a disabled perspective, but also everyone being able to just use the train more easily. The third thing is also quite important. It's not as important as accessibility and safety, but the third thing is absolutely relevant to the railway, which is level boarding. Even just an improvement to the platform train interface, short of level boarding, but certainly level boarding, has been shown with research done in the UK and elsewhere to reduce dwell times. And when I say dwell times, what I mean is how long a train has to sit at a platform. And this is obvious, not just because if you have to put a ramp up, that takes ages, but even just if everyone's stepping onto the train, it takes a lot less time because you don't have to stand, wobble around on the huge gap and then choose where to put your feet. If you've got a level boarding interface, you don't even look down. You can stay on your phone angrily tweeting people and just step straight off the train. I say this from experience. You can do that, and therefore you get off the train much more quickly, which means you get people on and off the train, which means that in a rural railway, maybe it doesn't make a huge difference. But if you've got a suburban or an urban, or even in some cases a high-frequency long-distance service, if you're reducing the dwell time of a train from 3 minutes down to 2 minutes, or 3 minutes down to even 2.5 minutes, you're increasing how many trains you can run an hour, which means the railway is running higher capacity, which means if you're an accountancy wonk, that's more revenue. If you're a sane person like you and I, that means more people being able to travel by train. Because if you're running more trains, that's less carbon in the atmosphere from people driving. So there's three things: safety, accessibility, and also improving capacity of the railway.
Yeah, on that dwell times, that was something I really noticed in Japan. just how fast the Shinkansen trade
yeah.
over when they get into a station. It's crazy. Like these things are coming into Tokyo Station about every 4 to 6 minutes. So this is like a train that goes 300 kilometers an hour. It carries over 1,000 people, and it's going every 6 minutes. But some of these Shinkansen at some of the smaller stations especially, but I mean, they'll just stop for a minute or two. It's kind of shocking. But again, like they have platform screen doors that tell you exactly where to stand. The doors open, it's all level. People get on and off very quickly, and then it's on its way. And it's such a difference. It makes such a difference. Also, when you're sitting on the train, of course, you don't sit at a station for a whole long time. You're not going, where the hell are we going? I want to be moving on. You know, it stops. People get on and off, and it goes. It's great.
There's two things there you've touched on. One is permeability, and the other is progress. These are two critical features of public transport systems, is that you want permeability, whether that's, permeability through the station onto a train, permeability between different modes, permeability of active travel onto. So permeability is key. The ability to just move seamlessly onto the train, and then progress, that feeling of progress. If you're on a bus that takes absolutely ages and it goes zigzagging and doesn't go in a straight line, or if you're on a cycle path that is not following the natural route that goes off because it's been deprioritized for a highway or whatever, or if you're sat in a train that's, as you say, just in station for 10 minutes and then trundling away for a bit, that's not good. It doesn't encourage you to reuse that system. In Japan, they've absolutely got progress down because they have a unique approach to high-speed rail in Japan, which is make the trains out of paper and strap a rocket onto it. So they are bafflingly powerful, the trains, and they are not crash-worthy deliberately because they have an overall system that proves crash-worthiness in the sense that those trains will never crash. The infrastructure system is designed to always fail safe. So they can have very, very lightweight trains that accelerate like the proverbial off a shovel. Yeah,
I mean, I'm actually working on a video that talks about exactly that. There has never been a crash of a Shinkansen since they began in the 1960s, which is amazing. But that is
absolutely incredible.
A separate issue. Let's get back to level boarding. But yeah, it's all part of the same thing.
In a way, it's that systems thinking. Japan has level boarding so extensively because it's part of that system thinking of we need level boarding to get the dwell times down to make our railway system work. And I suppose one of the key things, the drum that I'll bang has got systems thinking, systems engineering printed on it in impact font, because it's really key that you cannot think of level boarding as just a platform issue, just a train issue, or even the two just uniquely together. You have to have the whole system, absolutely.
So, okay, I think people might be thinking about this and they think, okay, so there's a train and there's a platform, just make them the same height. What's the big deal? Like, why is this even a thing?
Yeah, so I'm going to use GB specifically. I'm not saying UK because Northern Ireland is its own separate railway system that's really basically part of the Irish railway system. Different gauge, different everything. So I'm just going to talk about GB right now.
Okay.
But the things I'm going to talk about are kind of true in other countries in different ways, different reasons, but broadly similar challenges. So the issue you have in GB is that you have a mixed traffic railway by and large. We have a scandalous lack of dedicated suburban railway systems. And that means that you have a railway that has to carry all sorts of different shapes of train. And we're talking, freight, long distance services, suburban services, electric versus diesel. And the challenge with all these different combinations is that they all have different shapes and different amounts of kit underneath, above. One thing they all also have in common is that for various reasons, we've decided to have our floor height of our passenger trains about 1,100 millimeters. And our platform height is the standard is exactly 915 millimeters. So you've got a difference of about 200 millimeters off the bat there in the standard position of the train floor, which, by the way, is only really there because that's where the stagecoach floor was in the 1700s. And we've kind of just not really challenged it since. And a lot of our trains kind of come from a much smaller batch of designs that British Rail did. The Crossrail trains, for example, are a direct lineage to British Rail design networkers, and before that even. So lots of our trains come from small origins, again, so they all have the similar floor height. Only recently have we had the Swiss have come in and bucked that trend by going, hey, why don't you put the floor at the same height as the platform? And so we will do it. We're Swiss. We know that's the right thing to do. And so Stadler came in and provided what we euphemistically call a low-floor train, the Class 777s on the Merseyrail system. So that's the fairly self-contained, but still mixed. It's not fully self-contained. Those platforms are set to the national standard. That's the first level boarding system on the national rail network as in Merseyrail. And it was because Stadler went, well, it's because there was a really nasty fatality on one of the platforms on that system. And also there's a certain level of devolution to the Liverpool Combined Authority, the sort of regional authority. They therefore had control over their railway system. And they said, we need to do the right thing here. And we have to take the system approach to avoid, we've rightly been challenged on this fatality, really nasty dragging fatality of a young woman at a platform. We've got a new fleet coming in to replace our knackered old BR stock. This has to be provide level boarding. It has to. And so they took that system approach, and Stadler came forward with, well, you put the floor of the train to the right height. Now, the reason why lots of people in GB right now go, oh, why don't we raise the platforms a bit like Crossrail have? The reason why you cannot raise the platform, so raising the platform, the Crossrail Central Tunnel, all the platforms are set at around about 1150 millimeters, well, exactly 1150 millimeters, to match the floor of the Aventra trains that run through the system. That looks great in the central section.
Right.
The trouble is Crossrail runs out to lots of stations on the national network either side of the central tunnels that all have the platform at the national standard because they run freight. Automatically, you've locked in a difference of either we rebuild all the platforms in the central tunnels, probably at a cost of £1 billion, or the alternative is that we somehow exclude freight and completely rebuild all the platforms outside of that, which is also impossible. So by not designing the train to be low floor, they have locked in inaccessibility on Crossrail. Very bad move from TfL and the Transport for London, the Transport Authority for London, and the Department for Transport, the UK government body, to make that decision. And the challenge is you cannot raise the platform because a platform that matches those floor heights gets in the way of freight trains. So if you want to then provide clearance for freight trains on the mixed traffic railway, you actually have to pull the platform back by about 300 millimeters, which creates what I would describe as a Grand Canyon, if you like, between the platform and the train that is absolutely impossible to bridge.
That's a big gap.
It's just basically a non-starter, right? This is not practical. So that's the challenge. That's why the advantage of the national platform standard in GB is that everything fits. Every train that we run fits that 915 millimeter platform height with a standard offset of 730 millimeters. So that's the standard. We should then therefore design everything to it. Yes, lots of platforms do not match the standard. But that's why, as is currently happening in the Netherlands right now, there is a national rolling program of platform corrections setting all the platforms to the standard offset, which is 760 millimeters in the Netherlands, I think, is the standard.
Yeah, I've seen that happening already in the trains that I take. Yeah. The intercity trains do not have level boarding. You have to step up into them. But the sprinter trains, which are the stopping trains, they do, and they very consistently do here, and actually become really good. There are new intercity trains called the ICNG, the Intercity Next Generation, I think, not very original name. They do have level boarding, so they are starting to roll that out as well. And I'm seeing platforms changing as they do construction. The platforms are changing to that standard as well, which is so great to see, because I've had viewers who are in wheelchairs contact me and say that it is incredibly frustrating for them to take the train because, as you said earlier in this conversation, they have to call ahead and arrange for a ramp. And that's bullshit. Nobody should have to do that for the train.
Why on earth we think that is acceptable? It's just absolutely unacceptable.
It blows my mind, right?
Anyone sits and goes, yes, that's fine.
Yeah.
Grandfather rights is a dirty word that we should do our very best to just wipe out from the railway. Honestly, if anyone wants to understand what this misery is like, go on Twitter, follow as many disabled activists as you can, and when they take the train, because they often do, because the train is still a convenient way to travel and should be, and they're wanting to do the right thing, travel by train rather than driving.
Well, actually, disabled people are more likely to not have a driver's license too.
Yeah, often they're excluded by the car-centric world that we have built has excluded disabled people to a huge extent. Anyway, so follow those people and listen to their stories of, oh yeah, I was supposed to get off at this station, but no one turned up. So I sat at the door of the train and then it pulled away and I ended up in Edinburgh instead of in Morpeth or whatever it is. You know, I ended up 100 miles away from where I was supposed to be because no one came to collect me. Or I ended up sat in a terminal station and no one came and found me. I just sat on the train and it took me to the depot. You know, stuff like this, just like awful, awful stories. And it's not a complicated fix. Engineers are guilty of doing it. Railway policy people, railway leadership. I have battles constantly with people within the rail industry going, oh, well, I think you'll find it's actually quite difficult and you can't do level boarding everywhere. It's like, yes, you can. The solutions are quite straightforward. The engineering is pretty straightforward. It's political will that's the problem. And the fact that there is not as the Netherlands has done, you have a rolling program, a dedicated fund of cash, a dedicated team that does this work to platforms. And then you combine that with the fleet upgrade. So every time you buy a new fleet, you buy a fleet that fits.
Right.
Because it's not acceptable to continue to exclude, 1 in every 5 travelers potentially who are having an uncomfortable traveling experience, if not an almost impossible one.
Yeah, it just absolutely blows my mind. And again, I think you're right. This is not rocket science, right? Like, this is talking about the heights of trains. Now, there are reasons why they'll say, oh, it's hard to get a train made at that height because, we have certain equipment that has to go underneath. And I mean, talk a little bit about that, but I still think that's bullshit. It's just a cost issue and design issue. But
yeah, again, the railway is a system, right? So in GB, the challenge with when you've got a substantial amount of our railway network is not electrified. That means that we have diesel multiple units. Diesel multiple units require quite a lot of kit to be carried under the train, and fitting that kit underneath a low floor train becomes much more challenging. But there are solutions. Stadler's solution on Greater Anglia, because there are more Stadler trains now running, they put what is known as the thrash box onto their bi-mode train. So they've got an electric train, but it also has this funny little box in the middle. It's called the thrash box. It makes a loud noise, has a diesel engine in it, and powers a train. Their train is low-floored, and therefore, rather than having the underslung kit, they've put all the diesel power into the little thrash box, which also, by the way, you can get rid of when you fully electrify the route. So it's a little bit of a Britain's bodged lack of electrification is another contributor to us not having a better railway. This is a good reason to do electrification because electric trains have less kit. They're much, much simpler than diesel trains, so you don't need all the kit underneath. So it's much easier to drop the floor, hence why it's happened on dedicated electric suburban trains like the Tyne-Wear Metro new trains are low-floored. Merseyrail, as I've already talked about. Incidentally, these are all Stadler trains. Alstom, one of the other train manufacturers, is now thankfully threatening us with a low floor design based on some of the units they're rolling out in Europe and in Ireland at the moment. So the other manufacturers are catching up. Stadler absolutely way out ahead in terms of providing that in GB and going, oh yeah, that's fine. We just do it. It's not a problem. I don't know why I went Dutch rather than German there, but anyway, there are lots of challenges. Platform curvature, again, you solve that with a very commonly designed gap filler that the Swiss have had on their trains for 30 years, 40 years. Lift thresholds when you have to lift platforms and change platform profiles. And yes, all that stuff is fiddly, but it's not complex engineering-wise. It's just that if you have a government unwilling to pay for it, it becomes fiddly. But the reality is that on small stations, it's easy. On massive stations, like, say, one of the biggest culprits for this, Clapham Junction, one of the most complicated stations in the UK.
Yeah, that's a busy station.
It's overdue a massive remodeling and reconstruction anyway. It's 10 years overdue being, it's got a depot in the middle of it. It's horrible for all sorts of reasons. Just flatten the thing and start again anyway. It is overdue a massive remodeling. And you see in other stations, big stations, London Bridge has had a reconstruction and all the platforms are standardized. King's Cross has had this happen. Euston, overdue, will happen. St Pancras already had it. So these big stations, there's a cycle of the big work happening. And then at that point, you get the problem solved. Scotland is in an interesting place because they've done a lot of work on the majority of their, if you like, Scotland is 2 railway networks. It's basically a massive suburban railway system with like 6 branch lines, 6 rural branch lines. Scotland's railway network is a bit of a funny one. Most of the stations in that suburban core, so basically I'm talking about Glasgow and Edinburgh, in that big smash of railway lines, most of their stations have been relayed recently enough that they're pretty much all at the standard. So they're in a situation where actually they can now start going, you know what, most of our platforms are set, apart from bloody Dunkeld and Burnham on the Highland Main Line. They have little boxes on that platform, that's another story. Most of their platforms are set, so they can start talking about level boarding, getting the trains that fit pretty soon. So systems thinking, it's about planning ahead, but it's about that long-term strategy and going, we need this to happen. These are the benefits. Thou shalt set all platforms that you touch to the standard offset and not fight about avoiding doing that work.
Right. I mean, that's really the trick, right? I mean, it's setting the standards in place and just sticking to them. Say every time, doesn't mean you have to go replace them all right now, but like you said, every time there's new construction, you upgrade the platform height to this level. This is the standard. And every time you buy a new train, this is the height of the platform.
Exactly, yeah. So you get the floor of the train set. So one of the challenges we had was that, and I've seen this, in fact, I name names, CAF as a train manufacturer, they were asked to provide level boarding on a new fleet they've just been asked to provide for one of the train operators in the UK. And they responded by basically putting 2 or 3 extra zeros on the cost of a level boarding train to just make it not happen. And the other train manufacturers that would do level boarding, Stadler, have a full order book and just don't have the capacity to deliver any more trains. And also the UK market is doolally because don't look at what's going on in the UK right now. We're a basket case. So the challenge you've got is that train manufacturers hold a monopoly and basically hold the cards. And until government stands up to those train manufacturers and said, we're not buying your train unless you provide level boarding, they will push back. The context of Crossrail, and this is a bit of an instructive story, and this happens in other countries as well. The context for Crossrail is that Siemens had just won the Thameslink new train contract, a high floor train solution, by the way.
Right.
So that meant that Derby had to win the next contract, the next big train contract, which was the Crossrail contract. Derby were unwilling to spend any money on doing anything other than just basically providing the same trains they'd been building for the last 20 years, which was basically an advanced version of the Electrostar, which was the Aventra. This is very train nerdy stuff, but there's going to be plenty of people listening to this who absolutely love it, so I'm not going to hold back. They went for their train platform, which basically, sorry, that's the wrong word to use, their train solution. Platforms and platforms.
Yeah.
Solution,
a different word, platform, but
yes, their train solution, which was a high floor train. They were not willing to spend the R&D money on a low floor solution because it would have meant basically completely redesigning the train. So we got stuck with a high floor solution, and they convinced the designers to go for high platforms. So you get stuck in this loop. It requires people to understand the big picture. And when I say systems thinkers, I don't mean people who kind of like have ones and zeros flying past their eyes. I just mean people who have that long-term vision of what the railway ought to be. That everyone dancing around in a circle, Simpsons meme, of like the happy transport future that there ought to be. Because without that view of the future, it's difficult for you to plot a course to it. I think that's really important. People should be excited and imaginative about the future, and that's how you solve these problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this is the way you solve an awful lot of problems when it comes to urban planning, for example, like here in the Netherlands, where they have standards for safe bicycle infrastructure, for example, and then they just have it there to say, every time you redesign a street, this is what it looks like. And then it's not a question of, should we do this? Are we doing that? This is it. This is it. This is it across the whole country. This is it. And streets need to be redesigned about every 30 years. And the same thing goes for train stations, and the same thing goes for train rolling stock.
Exactly. These things are cyclical, and you take those opportunities at every cycle to solve the problem. The challenge we've got in GB is that we do boom and bust, which means that rather than having like a nice smooth spread of rolling stock upgrades, we tend to do it in an enormous chaotic panic, and then nothing for a while, and all our train manufacturers that are in the UK go bust. And then we have a mad chaos again, and we do it on about a 20-year cycle of that. And we just had one of those about 5 years ago where we like replaced a third of the trains in GB all at once. And unfortunately, the majority of those were high floored. There is some optimism to be had because the fact that we now have some systems showing what level boarding looks like in the UK. You talked about it with Japan. The fact that you saw that, suddenly it's like, you go back to a system that doesn't have level boarding and you find yourself tripping over because it's so ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
Yeah, the advantage of there now being in GB level boarding systems, Merseyrail, Tyne Metro, and Greater Anglia on some of their fleet have level boarding. People are now seeing what that looks like, and it's now much more difficult for politicians who basically fund these projects to wiggle away from that as a solution. And thankfully, we are now seeing level boarding as a phrase being part of the procurement of new train fleets going forward. So the dial has shifted, thankfully, in the UK. We're not through the woods yet. There are a lot of difficult attitudes tied to the overall idea that we shouldn't spend any money on anything. And, you know, the idea that we need to just wind Britain down as a going concern obviously gets in the way of spending money for the future. But the dial has shifted a bit, which is positive.
Well, I think this is the trick. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this, because I feel like if there's any listeners that don't really know about level boarding or haven't really thought about it, they should think about it. And these are the kind of questions that people should be asking when there are train projects going on. You need to say, will it have level boarding? And if it doesn't, why not? And, you know, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, you know, we got different types of trains. Oh, we got this. Like, really, no. This has to be, as far as I'm concerned, this is an absolute must-have on any new transit project. Why would you accept anything else? It just blows my mind that we're willing to accept this. And it's one of these things where transit users are just treated like second-class citizens here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There can be no more perfect type of technology to provide a perfect interface between the vehicle and the static infrastructure than a railway that has a fixed guidance system, steel rails,
they're on rails,
steel wheels. It's perfect.
They're always going to go to the same place. So I do want to go back to one thing that you talked about a little bit, because you just kind of went over it, and I think maybe people missed it, but these gap fillers. So yes. I have seen these gap fillers. These are the things that come out of the train. Tell me a little bit about the gap fillers.
So on straight platforms, which are a rare thing on the railway because the railway has to kink and bend around things because our world is not Minecraft. So straight platforms, you can design a platform and a train that perfectly match each other. As I say, though, that's a rare situation. Right. Straight platforms, so for example, in GB, 2/3 of platforms are curved. 6,000 platforms and 4,000 of them are curved. Now, what that means is if you can imagine that you've got your bit of Hornby track, your bit of model railway track, and it's a curve, if you can imagine your coach with the bogies, so that's the pairs of axles that rotate on top of the rectangle of the coach, if you like, or the carriage, well, that means that you've got a square, kind of a rectangular shape against a curved shape, which means that depending on where that coach is sitting against the platform, there are different distances. So it'll vary. So if you have a curve in one direction, you might have doors that are really close to the platform. A curve in the other direction, they might be really far away from the platform. That's a design thing I have to work out when I'm doing gauge clearance analysis. We call that curve overthrow. And that means that if you've got different stop with different doors in different places, positioned in different places in relation to the wheels, then you're going to have different distances. And the way to deal with that is either by ignoring it and causing a lot of problems, or by introducing a gap filler. Now, sometimes people say, well, put the gap filler on the platform. I would argue against that because, firstly, going on track to maintain that thing means you're closing the railway and putting staff in danger. And also, if that gap filler fails in the wrong way, you've got rid of a platform. Whereas if a gap filler fails on a train, you've just got rid of a train and you can put the train somewhere else. So put the gap filler on the train. Also, trains can be maintained safely in a depot every night. So put the gap filler on the train. The gap filler does what it says on the tin. Mostly you can't have lasers on railways, so there's an optical sensor that basically goes, oh, let's shoot this thing out to the distance that is maybe 1 centimetre or 2 centimetres. Actually, I think the maximum is maybe like 1.5 centimeters. Anyway, some reasonably small distance off the edge of the platform. It's not perfectly level with the floor of the train because there's obviously some little lip for the thing to slide in and out of, but it provides an essentially level surface between the train floor onto the gap filler, which will be a set distance, and then there'll be a little bit of a gap, and then probably a slight step to then get back onto the platform. And there are obviously standards that dictate exactly what those interfaces can be to make sure that, for example, types of wheelchair wheel don't get stuck in that groove. Because even if it's quite a shallow groove, get that wrong and a wheel can get lodged in there. So the design has to be done carefully. But those gap fillers have been working on the Swiss railway system for a long time. They are now working in various trains in GB. They're brilliant. There's a little bit of time for them to shoot out, then the door opens. So that adds a little bit, but it's saved immediately. That time is saved immediately by how quickly everyone gets on and off the train.
And that time is in seconds. I mean, I've seen these. I've seen these in a bunch of different countries. Switzerland, certainly. I've seen them in the Netherlands, and of course, they had them in Japan and many places. It basically looks like the train is sticking out its tongue or something. It just pushes a little metal thing out in front of the door, and then the door opens. But as train stops, this thing sticks out until it almost touches the platform. Doors open, people get off. Nice and easy. And these are brilliant. They really are. They work really well.
Again, it's simple. It's not a hugely complex, over-engineered bit of kit. These are standard. What you do is you go to the person who's been building these for 35 years in some shed in Bern. You buy them, and then you attach them to your train. You don't reinvent the wheel. You go to the person in the shed who's been building these for 35 years or whatever, and you get them and you sellotape them onto your train, and you're good to go. Yeah. Okay, so there is some complexity in ensuring it's fitted into the interlocking of the train. But again, these are standard. They're as standard as doors are, to all intents and purposes.
Yeah, and I think what I really want to stress to people is that this is really not rocket science. This is pretty well understood engineering, and there are countries like Switzerland that just do this all the time, everywhere. These are all very much things that can be done. Sometimes a manufacturer may need to change some things, and there may be costs involved in that. But, this is not a serious engineering challenge. It's, again, mostly a political issue, and that people just don't want to spend the cash because they just don't care about transit users that much.
Just the thing that always surfaces in any discussion about transport or urbanism, whether it's wacky tech solutions or driverless cars or hyperloop, whatever it is, it's like the tech people think that it's a technological problem or an engineering problem. It isn't. We have solved the big questions in transit. The ideal transit system is basically how it looked in the 1920s. Trams, bicycles galore, open streets, everyone free walking around, and then good trains. That's basically the ideal, maybe the odd penny farthing for a laugh. That's basically the ideal transport. We've solved the big questions in transport. It's the political will to actually enact those systems. And it's absolutely true for this as a microcosm. Level boarding, it's absolutely true on that,
Yeah, it's one of those things that just drives me crazy. Because I've been involved in some of these conversations, not nearly like you have, but I've been, at community meetings when we're talking about transit projects in Canada. And they say, it's really difficult. And it's just so frustrating. It's just so incredibly frustrating.
I think the key way through that, we might circle back to it, but if I can be positive for a moment, the key thing that you and I are doing it right now is empowering people with that knowledge.
Exactly.
So when someone goes, oh, it's tricky, the person can go, actually, it isn't. You know what? It isn't. Here's a load of expertise saying it isn't. Here's some worked examples. Here's some places where it is working right now. And here's a freight train going through the same platform as this level boarding solution goes through. It's a solved problem. It's not tricky, actually. So it's empowering people with that knowledge, helping them to know where to go to get those case studies. And I'm sure we'll come back to that one. But to really flag that now, for anyone who's kind of partway through this episode and feeling despairing, don't despair. We are empowering you with the knowledge to actually solve these problems by informing the politicians and pushing back on perhaps those industry policymakers or the public front of the industry who are saying no, perhaps.
Well, I think the good news of it being a political issue is that politics can be influenced by people.
Yep.
So that is the good side of this. Just one more thing I want to talk about that we've kind of skipped over a couple times before we get to your organization and things is this freight train thing. So explain to people why freight trains are an issue.
So a sizable number of freight trains move boxes around. In fact, behind me, I have a book called The Box, which is a fantastic read talking about why container things, these shipping containers are everywhere now and why that's used as part of our globalized supply chains. Those things, by their very nature, have a cross-section that is a big rectangle.
Right.
And therefore, they have a pokey edge that sticks out. And depending on where the flatbed sits that the thing sits on top of, that might well sort of jab into the position that a platform could be in that might better meet a train, a high floor train, say. And so this is why earlier I talked about that 300 millimeter gap. Certainly with the GB loading gauge, we have to put our wagons, our flatbed wagons, very low because our bridges are all very low. So the top of those container boxes needs to be as low as possible so we don't score out the corners of all our lovely Stevenson-era arch overbridges.
Just one quick second. Explain loading gauge to people, because I know that will be one that a lot of people don't know.
Sorry, yes. Loading gauge. If you slice the railway as a cross-section, so slice a cross-section, loading gauge is the space within which you can fit trains on the infrastructure without making a loud noise and a lot of dust and maybe making a box cut a bridge in half.
And that includes platforms, but also tunnels, for example.
Tunnels, platforms, bridges, there's the bit above the train, so, like over bridges and station canopies and thinking about electrification equipment and all that stuff. Also, there's the stuff down below, like platforms, like certain types of bridges that have a girder that might well be close, fences, these sorts of things, ground signals, all this stuff. And all of that stuff is part of my day job, is making sure trains don't hit those things.
Right.
Also, trains hitting each other as well is an important thing you have to think about. But when it comes to this story, the level boarding story, and freight generally does its best to occupy as much of that loading gauge as possible. And generally, the most onerous thing is the big box that we carry around, those shipping containers, because naturally you want them to be as big as they possibly can be so that you can fit as much of your expensive Chinese goods in them.
But also, those shipping containers are a standard size, so we're not changing the shipping container.
Exactly. There is a range of them, but they are a fairly standardized size. They're standardized width.
Right.
They come in different heights. And so some of them are quite tall. To fit the standard height one on the GB network, we have to use very low wagons to get them through all those bridges. And that means that if you're putting the box quite low, that means the bottom corner of the box is close to platforms. That becomes a challenge. But also other things. It's not just those things. All the other freight wagons generally try and take up as much space as possible so you can fit as much of your powdered egg or, I don't know, whiskey bottles or whatever it happens to be that you're moving around in the back of an open container, as everyone does these days. Whatever it is, you want to carry as much of it as possible, so you're using up that loading gauge. So that becomes a challenge at the platform because the platform often kind of cuts into that space. This is where the systems thinking is really important. This is where understanding, well, actually, we know in GB that the standard platform position of X equals 730, Y equals 915, that position allows all freight to pass. Every combination of freight that we allow on our railway can pass that platform safely, including through curves.
Right.
So we know that platform position. So let's stick with that standard. As soon as we start talking about raising platforms or humps or all these things, they start causing problems for freight. Unless we're going to build a completely brand new dedicated freight railway system, which we're obviously not, it'd be a stupid thing to do. We have to think about freight running on our railway because it's a good thing to move freight around on our railway. And so you have to think, we need to understand that interrelationship and actually understand that it isn't a problem for level boarding. And in fact, we know that it isn't. We know that the solutions for level boarding we have in GB and in all the other countries that have level boarding, Switzerland again, have a very mixed, they've more than any other country have a mixed traffic railway and a very successful one. Yeah. And they have level boarding without any problems. So freight isn't a problem for level boarding. But you have to understand the problem and implement the right solution. And again, this comes back to the fact that it's not rocket science. It just requires the right level of thinking in the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. I think people understand level boarding and some of the challenges now. So just as we finish off this conversation, I want you to talk a little bit about your organization that you've helped to co-found.
Yeah. So it's an interesting one. The Campaign for Level Boarding, it's a very small group of people, but it's kind of umbrellaed a bunch of different disabled activists. Right. So it's mostly disability campaigners, people whose voice needs to be heard and who understand that there is a solution, who come from a transport activism background, so they understand the system, they understand the railway system, they also travel using it, so they know it very well in a way that, that I could not. Obviously I have my experience with the buggy, but it's not the same as being completely impacted on the way you travel by the design of the railway system. Disability is about the fact that the environment is disabling you. That's what disability is about. It's about the fact that the built environment is preventing you from living a normal life. And level boarding is a way to break down one of those myriad barriers. So I had this chat with Tanya Gray-Thompson. She said, I know this campaigner, and I also knew a couple of campaigners, the late great Alan Benson, who's sadly now died, was Transport for All in the UK. A group of us all kind of came together. We met down in Westminster and said, right, one of the things we need to do is start pestering government on this stuff. But also the main thing we want to do is get that word, get the lexicon out there, get the words level boarding out there so that people hear it so often, they understand it, they experience it. So myself and one of the very senior people involved, in fact, the guy who was in charge of bringing the Merseyrail level boarding fleet to bear, a chap called David Powell, he and I were the engineering railway side, and everyone else were disabled and transport activist campaigners. Some were involved in doing work for Network Rail, who's the equivalent of ProRail in the Netherlands, sort of the infrastructure manager. And so we all came together and said, right, we need to get level boarding as a phrase out there, so just bombard that story with people. We're going to also proactively get involved with the various consultation work that happens happens for train operators and have representatives there. We'll provide a bit of a single point of contact for this discussion for politicians or for think tankers or policy developers. And that's kind of what we've done. And in a way, Brexit got in the way hugely because all the logjam of basically Westminster hasn't worked since 2016 because so much bandwidth has been focused on that mess that all the normal workings of Parliament have kind of not been able to happen. So one of the things we wanted to do was get a parliamentary group moving. We haven't. But despite all that, we've managed to turn the dial because level boarding is now a known quantity across the industry. So in a way, we've kind of succeeded that new fleets are now, it's now becoming a public challenge if they don't have level boarding. So we've kind of succeeded in that sense, but we're not there yet. We're still at the bottom of the hill. It's just that we've got a bit of a map now.
So where can people go to find out more information about this?
Yeah, so people can just Google campaign for level boarding.
Yep.
A really good introduction to what level boarding is in a bit more detail is I've written some pieces, so you can pester me on Twitter to find those or just Google them. There's also one of my podcast episodes, Rail Natter, goes on level boarding. There's a particular episode that's also audio transcribed by Doug, who's one of my co-conspirators at the campaign. So you can go in and watch that. That goes into some of the detail in the history. So there's loads of resources out there, but just Google campaign for level boarding and you'll find loads of resources. There's an FAQ, there's some work studies. Actually, we refer to the Netherlands a bit in there as well. So plenty of information in there.
Yeah, that is absolutely fantastic. And I think, again, what I really want to stress to people is you got to know what level boarding is, you got to know to ask for it, and you got to push back a little bit when people are like, well, you know, there's still freight trains running on this line, or, well, you know, we've got a lot of different trains running, and any of that. No, that's not really acceptable. I want people to know, I want people to understand this because I want everybody to be able to take trains, and I want it to be easy, and I want it to be safe, and I want them to run more efficiently. And this is a big part of that.
Absolutely. We want more people to be on the train. It's a simple ask, and this is absolutely a critical component in enabling that happen. Yeah, no, absolutely, Jason. I just could not agree more. Does this provide level boarding? If not, why not? And then as you get those excuses, back them out of the way, a bit like that scene in Airplane. Yeah, none of the excuses really stand up to scrutiny.
That's an obscure reference.
Yeah, it is an obscure reference. I'm so sorry, but you got it. So
no, I got it. I love Airplane. And it's one of my favorite movies of all time. Surely you can't be serious.
Don't call me Shirley.
Anyway, very much appreciate you coming on. And I really hope that people will Google the campaign for level boarding and read more about this and see, because you do have some great information online. So thanks so much for coming on. And hopefully we can have you on again to chat about other rail issues. But thanks so much for coming on, Gareth.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Any last thoughts there before we close off?
No, just honestly, an absolute pleasure to be on. Great to come on again and talk about other train shenanigans and see if we can demystify some more stuff. But no, absolute pleasure.
And if you're really into trains, you can listen to Gareth's podcast, Rail Natter, which goes fully in depth into all things train related.
It does. And in a bizarre and unique kind of self-punishment, most of the time it goes out live. So you can actually come in and ask questions while I record the podcast, which is a bizarre and unique feature of my strange little railway podcast. But no, it's an absolute pleasure to have you along. There's a lovely little community you can be part of who watch that along as well. Small, but perfectly formed. Let's put it that way.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Gareth. That's all we have on the agenda for today. I hope you enjoyed listening to it almost as much as we enjoyed making it. I really enjoy talking to other content creators about what they find interesting, and a lot of the people I have on this podcast I met since joining Nebula. Nebula is the subscription streaming service created by and for educational content creators and the people who love their content. Nebula has all sorts of educational content, from videos to podcasts to classes by your favorite creators, as well as Nebula Originals, which are high-budget productions. Honestly, Nebula is such a great platform, and I'm so happy for my content to be available there. If you use our special link, which is nebula.tv/agenda, you'll get a discount off an annual membership, which comes to only $30 a year, which I think is a fantastic deal. So check out Nebula at nebula.tv/agenda and see if there's something of interest to you. At the very least, you'll be able to hear every episode of the Urbanist Agenda a little bit earlier than everyone else, so you can get the inside scoop on what we're plotting and scheming. Thanks again for listening, and maybe next time you'll be listening on Nebula.